That's so cool.
It's okay.
It's going to be amazing. Yes. It's going to be amazing.
That's probably enough drinks for tonight.
That's so cool. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be amazing.
That's probably enough drinks for tonight.
Yes. That's so cool.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yes. That's so cool.
That's probably enough drinks for tonight.
That's so cool.
It's okay.
Yes. It's going to be amazing.
It's okay.
Yes. That's so cool.
That's probably enough drinks for tonight.
Oh! Welcome everyone to another Percona live stream. Today, I am joined by two awesome guests to talk about MySQL, Marcelo and Pep. How are you both doing today?
Perfect.
I'm
Perfect.
doing
I'm perfect.
doing good as well. How are you doing, Matt and Pep?
Good. We are on three different continents today. How about that,
Fantastic.
right? Like this is a momentous occasion. This is, I think, the first time I've been on three continents, right? So we're in three different locations. We're all live. We're here to talk about MySQL. And I'm trying to stave off a ton of questions from my mother-in-law today, who she has this habit like of finding houses that she doesn't want to buy, but she'll send them to me and say, "Is this close to you? Can I move by you?" And she does this all the time, and so she decided to start that like 2 minutes ago, and I'm like, I am on a live stream right now. So but that's not good. It's the mother-in-law. She wants to press it, but that's okay. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you to those who are out in the live stream sphere here. We hope that you enjoy our chat. This is our continual meetup schedule. We try to do one of these a week. Because of holidays coming up, we're going to adjust the schedule, so stay tuned for that. Next week, we're actually going to be skipping a week because I'm not going to be available to host. And, so we'll see how that goes, and then we'll just kind of rearrange some things for the rest of the year. But if you are here, thank you. This is an open forum. Feel free to ask questions in chat. We will pop them up on screen. We will talk about them. We'll try and answer any of the questions that do come up from the community. We are here to help everyone out there learn a little bit more about MySQL today. So, Pep, why don't we start with you? Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about you, and we can just kind of go from there.
Well, my name is Pep. Pep Pla. I'm 50 years old, so it's quite half a century. So it's quite a nice age. I've been working as a DBA for diverse technologies for the last 30 years or so. So I worked with Oracle and SQL Server and DB2, and around 15 years ago, I decided to do the switch, to open source technologies, and especially MySQL. And I'm married. I'm father of 3 kids, and I'm living in Barcelona currently.
So you're our European continent person today,
Yes.
So representing the continent of Europe, which is awesome. So Pep, you've been very passionate about the database space and love MySQL. I've had you stop by and chat with me on the podcast, so I appreciate you being here today. I know you're going to talk about some toolkit things. We're also going to be talking about Xtrabackup as a group. Always fun activities there. But let me go ahead and have Marcelo introduce himself a little bit to the audience today. Marcelo?
Hello, everyone. So my name is Marcelo Altmann. I am based in Brazil, in southmost part of Brazil. In terms of databases and work-related stuffs, I started with MySQL in 2006 as a lump developer, like it was what was in the stack, and I kind of improved from there. It was around like 2011, 12 when I actually became more expert in MySQL. I used to work for a company that was like the country code top level domain in Ireland, and like one of the first tasks I had to do there was to actually create a backup strategy. They actually had an issue a few years before I joined where they suffered an outage. They had to restore a backup, and they figured out at the time that they were restoring, it was not working. So it was a difficult time for them. So that was like the first um, task I had to do, and that's where I had to do like a deep dive and research about mostly like everything about backups and like what's a backup, it's what's important, what is not, when a backup can be considered a backup, and from
So
there.
Marcelo, right now you're doing a lot of engineering work.
Yeah, so from there I moved to Percona. I started as a support engineer, and while I was at support, I got a case where a client was complaining that after restoring a backup, like the slave was not behaving the same way as the master, and that was because the buffer pool was not warm up. And one of the first things I did as an engineer on my spare time was to actually adventure myself with extra backup. And it will be, MySQL already had like the ability to dump the buffer pool since 5.6, but extra backup was not aware of that. So the first thing I did as a, I was still a support engineer, but was create the ability on extra backup so you could instruct it to dump the buffer pool at the end of the backup. So when you restore the backup, MySQL recognize that file that has table spaces and IDs, and it knows what tables or what pages it has to restore after you bring your server back up. So, and like for things like Percona XRDB cluster, when you have to do like snapshot transfer, when you provision a new node, like it starts the node behaving exactly as the writer was. Or so it was first time I did something as an engineer, and a year later I actually moved from being a spare time engineer to actually become part of the C++
Well, so
MySQL.
maybe you can explain to those who might not know, why is that important that you would potentially restore the buffer pool during a backup process? What does that accomplish?
So basically, INODB works 100% in memory in when you talk about reads and writes. So of course, like you persist your data into disk files, but every time you have to do a read or a write, this particular page has to be on the buffer pool, on this huge memory area that you configure, like as much as you have, the better, the faster it will perform. But all the operations are done on this area in memory, and then later they are persisted to disk. So as you can imagine, like memory, it's way faster than disk. So if you start your server, uh, clean every single read you have to do, let's say for a select, you have to read 1,000 pages. Those 1,000 pages will have to, it will check on memory, it's not there. It will have to go to disk, figure out where this is in your disk layout, read that page, put that in memory, and go to the next page. So as you can imagine, this is it's a costly process. But and like the buffer pool, it has some algorithms in terms of what pages it should keep there, like the most accessed ones, and has some protections in terms of if you do a full table scan, for example, it does not overwrite like your actually hot data that it's been accessed more often. But you have the ability then to get a snapshot of those pages, not the pages itself, just an identifier, so the server knows which pages it should load. And then if you do that once you are doing a backup on a master, or in case like extra DB cluster on a writer node, once you restore this backup, MySQL will identify this file, and it knows like this specific file has the pages that I have to load. So it will start like a background thread that will start to read those pages in disk ahead. So while you are starting your server, there is this term of warming up. So you are warming up your server. Before 5.6, there were ways to do that, like you issue a select star on all the tables and things like that, so you could populate your buffer pool with this data. But was not precise, because you may be losing data that was not there in case your data size it's bigger than the size in memory. So with this feature on Xtrabackup, you will actually have your slave or the node that you are just provisioning with the same pages in memory as your source was, and those things improve performance drastically.
Yeah. So basically, when you're restoring a backup, whether it's to a server that crashed, a replica, development node, whatever, the mean time to actually get to the point where you were when the crash happened is fairly long, because nothing is in memory, so everything has to be read for the first time from disk. So
Yeah.
this process, this feature, this functionality basically starts the backup and starts warming that memory, so you don't have to incur that first read penalty.
Yeah, correct. You will have to read the data anyway, but rather than have like your select missing the hit on buffer pool and the select, like the client wait for that page to be restored in disk, that has been already done ahead once you started.
And that could be pretty big for a large data set.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So, so Pep, have you used that feature? Like,
Yes, actually, I have used it, not especially for backups, because well, sometimes it obviously this adds a little overhead in storage and backup time, because you have to dump this data. So if it's a pure backup, sometimes I don't use that option. If we are rebuilding a replica, we have to consider if it makes sense or not, because sometimes if it's a replica that it's used for different purposes, you are actually populating the buffer pool with data that it is not going to be used. Obviously, if you are, for example, going to use the backup to replace the source, the master, then that's an option you have to use for sure, especially if the dataset is massive and the server has a lot of memory. If you have a huge buffer pool, the impact in terms of performance can be really very high. The warm-up time can be really very, very large. So it's an option that you can it's really very useful, but you need to decide if it makes sense or not. It will not harm you because it's done by background processes, so you can use it by default if you don't know what will be the use of the backup.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So Wagner, hello. Look, it's Mr. Bianchi here. He's saying hello.
Bianchi.
Yes. Wagner is a longtime collaborator in the community space. He's worked at Percona, he's worked at Maria, worked at several other companies. So, hey, glad to have you here today, Wagner. Hello to you out in live stream land. Appreciate you stopping by. But Pep, so you wanted to talk to us a little bit today, right, on some of the tools. And some of these tools can be used to help with not only performance or troubleshooting, but can help on these really large systems where you do have large buffer pools, where you do have large data sets.
Well, the Percona toolkit is there are so many useful tools that it's really hard to tell which are the best. But
everybody has your favorite, right?
Yes, I think There are a couple of tools that are like ping command. It's the PT summary thing. It's like when you try to connect to a server, you run ping. When you are connected to the server and you have installed the tools, the first thing you do is run a summary just to have an instant overview of what are you dealing with, and are really very simple tools. It's not, we are not going to discuss or talk about the different options of the summary tools. And being so important, so great tools, I'm surprised because lots of people don't know. There are a couple of tools that PT, MySQL Summary and PT Summary, that give you the information about your server.
Yeah, and
Other tools,
I think that's one of those things that it's like the hidden toolbox, right? That there's quite a few tools out there that not only you use from a support perspective or a consulting perspective on a regular basis, but a DBA could totally, make use of at any time or another. I mean, here I'm going to pop up, just so everybody can see. If you're not familiar with the toolkit, it is available on Percona's website. This is a PT summary that Pep was just mentioning, and there's also a MySQL summary as well. But it gives you the summary of that box. But anyways, Pep, go continue on.
and obviously online schema changes for large databases. It's always it's the same. I have to add a column, I have to create an index, and the table is really very large. I tried with the online default MySQL tools, and I have logs, or it's failing because my buffer is not my buffer for changes is not large enough. So it's a nightmare, and the PT Online schema change it's a tool built for this that does it perfect, that has a ton of options. So almost every problem you can have, there's an option that can help you.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's where, that there's a little Swiss Army knife tool for everything, especially for those who like to run on the command line, who might not have access to a graphical interface. A lot of people are moving towards, like we have Percona Monitor Management, but Grafana tool sets or other, tools that give more of the visual. But sometimes you don't have that access. Sometimes you just have access to a login and a shell, and you need to get data quickly. I think that, Pep, you mentioned, one of the most popular ones, which is PT Online schema change. I can tell you that the most dreaded thing in any application deployment is the actual migration or the deployment of code to production when it has large tables, large data structures. Because a lot of times, altering a table that's a terabyte, that can take hours, if not days, in some environments. And I've seen weeks, yes. And I think that's where, having, some, tools or something to help with those schema changes is important, but also to be able to quickly, identify rollback, to different versions is also critical. And I know other people have, I'm going to sneeze, I think, in a second. Always one of those things in the middle. I think that other people have looked at tools like this as well, like Ghost or other things to do similar things. Sorry, muted while I sneeze so you didn't get blown away. That's the issue with live, is you can't edit out the sneezes. But there are different tools out there to do similar things. But I think having that in your toolbox as a DBA or an SRE is critically important. I think one of the other things that's also often missed or often, kind of overlooked is drift between replicas, right? And so one of the tools that's been around, seemingly forever is the ability to check to see if your data between a replica and a primary are in sync or not. So things like, PT table checksum, or the ability to sync up. So PT table sync, right? Those are things you might not think about or realize, but it's so easy for someone to go into one of your replicas and accidentally delete something, or potentially to have something fail as replication moves data from one node to the next.
And,
Or
and
even
sometimes, sorry, Marcelo.
sorry. So or even like when you're provisioning iSlave, like without GTID or this kind of stuff, it's I've seen a ton of support cases where you just started your replication from the wrong positioning or things like that.
Yeah.
And going to the backup subject, like once you have completed your backup, like how do you ensure that you actually back up all the data, like that your backup is consistent? In this company that we had this backup lifecycle as part of testing the restore and ensuring marking a backup as usable. We used to restore the newly created backup as a replica, sync with master, and run PT table checksum to validate that actually 100% of the data that's supposed to be there, it's there. And the other thing you mentioned, okay, I have a drift. How do I fix this? To manually go and run checksum on every single table and select and dump GIF, it's a nightmare. And
It's a
like
lot. That's a lot of data.
yeah, it's a lot of data. And normally when those things happen, like it's error prone, like you are under stress, it's someone like on your neck.
Yes.
Oh, when are we gonna be back online? Why this select works on master, it doesn't work on the replica? And knowing though that you have those tools there, it's like ideally it's like a car insurance, you should never need them, but when something like that happens, it's always good to have that on your pocket,
Actually, sometimes you can have unwanted situations that on obviously always it's unwanted, but what I mean is you have a crash in the source, then you promote a replica, and somebody starts the old server that comes in and starts accepting writes, and all of a sudden you have your application is writing on two different nodes. You realize in, let's say, 3 minutes, but you have a 1,000, 10,000 transactions that have been written somewhere, and you are not completely sure about the integrity of the data. Having a tool, and then suddenly you are really stressed. Having a tool that you can use and that you can use to tell your boss, take it easy.
Well,
it was a disaster, but we can fix it. It's like, I would say a life insurance rather than a car insurance.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
But one other point is that when like you as a DBA will be prepared for that, to have scripts ready. Okay, if I have a data drift here, and the chances are that you will have a bug or something on your script is very high. And those tools are out there for years, so they are already mature for this type of situation. So that's other thing to consider as well. Like there is tons of users that have already used it, tested, and matured the software itself.
Yeah, and so Pep, you came on to my podcast and you said, stop thinking about backups, think about recovery. And something that you said, Marcelo, ties right into that, right? It's how do you test and ensure that those backups are, consistent? And you mentioned a really good practice, which is sometimes restoring and to a replica and then doing that checksum to see, did you capture everything? Can you do this process? And it is a time-consuming process. You can automate those checks, right? That chaining these tools together is not going to reduce the clock time it takes, but it will potentially save you the time to just sit there and type in the commands and wait for it to finish. But you can put that into an automated script that once a month pulls the latest backup, restores it, runs it up to a point in time, and then from that point on, you can run a checksum, and then you can check to see if the checksums match, and if they do, you can call it green, good, and you move on. And that can be built into that process.
And one very important thing about backups, like the first thing, like unless you can ensure that you can restore the backup, you don't have a backup. So it's just some files. And also, like in a case of an outage, it's always important to have those test practices that you do, like in test environments, to understand like what is the process to restore a backup in production and how long does it take. So for example, in case of an outage that I have to restore a backup, so you can communicate with the business saying, okay, to restore a backup, it's gonna be at least 6 hours, it's gonna be a day, it's gonna be, understanding how long it takes to complete the process. It's also something that it's really important to take into consideration and make it part of like the life cycle of the backup.
Yeah, let's take a pause here.
Lots of people uses logical backups as a backup, and the problem with logical backups is that it can take ages to restore a logical backup, depending on how you create it and how do you plan to restore it. It can take so long that it's not a backup because it's not good enough to bring your business back in town, because it will take 2 weeks. So you can't, if you have an e-commerce, you can say, okay, let's close those and I'll call you in 15 days. You can't do that. So obviously the time you need to recover a backup is even sometimes more important than recovering all the data. So you can skip some tables sometimes just to bring the database back as fast as possible. I like to define the backups, the untested backups, as the Schroedinger backup, because it's a bunch of data you have, but you don't know if you're able to restore it or not.
Yeah. Let's take a pause there. There's a few questions, a few comments. Let's throw them out there. Do we try to keep Toolkit MariaDB compatible? The answer is there isn't a concerted effort. A lot of the tools do work, and Wagner actually, did comment a little bit on that as well. Wagner mentions that he has the Percona toolkit and it works very well. And once he started using it, he uses it everywhere, which I think that a lot of DBAs who have used Toolkit, it is one of their favorite downloads to use. Each one of these scripts, yes, it's a bit of science on how to apply it and use it and figure that out. Yes, the GTID format is the one that can kind of have some incompatibilities with Maria. But Wagner does say that the majority of tools does work there as well. Now, we do have this on, can you use Toolkit on a Windows OS? Oh, what you were going to answer, Marcelo?
I can answer, yeah. The short answer is no. It's like they are actually like built in using Bash, perhaps like in the new versions that you can like emulate the Bash. But what when a customer has MySQL running on Windows OS, you can still use the toolkit by having like a Linux virtual machine or Docker with this installed. And the majority of the tools that only require like a connection to the database, like PT, online schema change, and those, you will be able to do that remotely from the.
Yeah, so there's two types of tools in Toolkit, right? So you've got the database specific tools and you have the environment specific tools. The environment specific tools won't necessarily work the same way you might think. Now, I have used some of the tools using the bash. And the bash, like the you can install Ubuntu on a Windows machine now, right? And so it does run, and I can bring up a terminal and do all the fun bash stuff. And some of the tools do work, some of them don't, right? It just depends on what's there. And so you've got that going for you as well. And I think Wagner says Sigwin, which is the old way of doing it. But I do the bash shell personally because I've been running 10. We're on Windows 11 now, so 10's been around for a while. But the database ones definitely will still work out of the box as well to do some of those things like checksum or syncing tables and things, or checking for indexes. Now, keep in mind that Toolkit was originally built as a lot of different tools because we needed to get these things done, and we got sick of typing in the commands by hand. Right? I mean, that's really what this was all about, was how can we come up with a collection that everyone can go out there and use?
And forgetting the commands, and then you need them.
Yeah, that's the bigger thing, right? To forget the comments and forget the other stuff, right? So they do work in a variety of environments, in a variety of settings. There's a tool to do a little bit of everything. Harry is happy that we say, hey, if you haven't restored the backup, you don't have a backup. It's interesting. So I worked back in the, it seems like the dark ages, but we used to have to do quarterly disaster recovery drills, where it would not just be a restore the backup recovery drill. It would be a fail over everything to a secondary data center, try and restore off tape, type of, recovery drill to make sure that everything happened. And I don't think that happens as much anymore, especially with a lot of medium, smaller size environments. I think bigger companies still do that. But, it is an interesting, space. A lot of people have made their own collections for checking replicas and doing checksums and different activities. That's cool. We're not saying Toolkit is the end all be all to replace all of, your custom stuff, but if you want something that has been battle tested by, thousands of different companies, this is kind of our collective knowledge put out there for people.
Other thing, like the best tool that exists out there is the one that works for you. Like if you have a bash script on your own and that works, you have tested, there is no reason to learn a new tool and overcomplicate the things. So if it works, that's
there is an interesting trend. I was just picked up something on Twitter the other day about that, something very similar. It was it was somebody mentioned the fact that there's so much information from companies like Netflix or Microsoft or Google about how to run your IT organizations. People forget 99% of companies are not their size and don't need their stuff. Right. I think that's one of the funny things that most people forget about is like, you hear about these great companies doing these awesome engineering feats, these feats of awesomeness that, you're like, wow, I wish I could do that. But those are pretty unique in terms of the size of data, the volume that's coming in, and they don't work for all use cases. And I think that's something that people often mistake. Like, oh, well, I want to do whatever big company A does for backups or for, recovery or for performance. Well, big company A spent, $100 million on that. Can you? Probably not. And so, I think it's worth noting. And of course, there's Perl. I prefer Python, but I'm not going to get all persnippety on Bash versus Perl versus Python. But we can all have our own preferences, and I would recommend you all, pick your favorite programming language and explore all the cool nuances that you can do. So, Marcelo, you were, you've been kind of in both worlds, engineering and in, the actual support space. So you've seen a little bit of everything. What's the most unusual thing that you've seen in your time? Like, is there something that like sticks out? Like he's smiling. So he has something that immediately popped into mind that he's like, wow, this is one of these crazy situations. I like to collect stories, and I'm sure people like to hear some of these stories on things they probably shouldn't or should do.
So one of the things that I normally say that I advise everyone that wants to become like a good DBA to not work for just a company, but to work in support of like a company like Percona, for example, because there are things you as a DBA will never do because there will be consequences of that, and you may not know how to come out of the situation you put yourself in. And one thing that popped at my mind right away is that I was in headquarters. I think the first time we met,
Oh,
and I was doing my shift, and there was a client that was running out of space, and he was using a database named MySQL. And to save some space, he found a directory inside the data named MySQL. And he said he never used that database. And he decided to delete that directory. So I don't
we
know,
don't
if
need
you
that
use
MySQL
Oracle,
directory.
yeah, if you use Oracle and you find a folder named Oracle, like you will not delete that folder because like that's the exact name of the binary you are running and such. So I that was like the most, I don't know, surprising thing I've seen a user doing.
Well, that is pretty interesting, right?
Yeah.
And what's funny is not doing like a drop database, but an RM, right? So an RM RF on the MySQL directory.
Yeah.
What I needed to clear up space. Why wouldn't I clean up space?
I never used this database. So
Yes.
I've seen people removing the InnoDB logs because they are logs. So I have two large files in the home directory that are just logs. I'm going to release some space, and I'll remove those files. And the good thing is that while the database is up, even after removing those files, you do not release the space. And the database is up and running and everything is fine. But if you stop the database, then you say bye-bye to those files and the database is not able to start anymore. So it's a ticking bomb that probably the DBA who removed the files, as he was not aware these files were important, just I removed the files and the space was not released. I'll remove something else. And
Yeah.
a couple of hours later, when there's a switch of file or the database stops, then all of a sudden,
Well, yeah,
things go very
like
bad.
Juka here says, he has, InnoDB log files, right? They get removed, or gzip, because who needs log files? Right? Log files can be removed. But no, that happens way more frequently. And those are the days where you really want to make sure your backups work. And I think that the craziest, and I've told the story a couple times, story that I've seen in the backup space is, you have your backups running in the wrong data center and you cut off access to that data center. And then, 2 months go by, everything's fine. Something happens in the new data center. You forgot to turn the backups on in the new data center after you flipped. Oops, backups were running over there, but that data is 2 months stale. It's the small things that matter quite a bit. Now, Harry had a question, so I wanted to get back to Harry's question. How do you know that your DB backup has been restored 100%? How do we know that, are there scripts? Are there things that you can do? I think one of the things we had mentioned, Harry, earlier on was set up your restored backup as a replica of the primary, and then you can run a checksum to check to see if the data is in sync. But what other methods have you, Marcelo and Pep, done to check to see if the restore had actually completed, other than saying it's done when you restore
it? Like I mentioned, like the one I actually used was PT table checksum, but this is actually a tricky question because I don't think there is kind of a right answer here, because, for example, the first 100 queries, okay, what if you were running MySQL dump and the dump was broken after the first 100, so there won't be a right answer here, and it's really tricky. In my personal opinion, it's like provisioning a slave and doing a point-in-time recovery and running checksum will be the most guaranteed one, but it's hard to say that it will be always 100%.
Well, and I think it's one of those questions that I'm going to say the worst words in business. It depends. Nobody likes to hear that, but it's probably more accurate than not, which is, like, are you doing like a point in time recovery? Are you rolling forward? What do you consider 100% restored, right? Because if you take a backup and you just restore it to the point the backup was taken, for some people that's 100%. For other people, they need to go to the second that they lost data. And even then, depending on how you've set up your database, you could be missing a second or more worth of data just because of, InnoDB configuration parameters or other things, or depending on how hard you crashed. So there's a lot of variance when you talk about 100% guarantee.
Yeah, and that something pops my mind that once I switched to engineering, one of the first things I had to work was on a research regarding to extra backup locked DDLs per table. While I was researching a bug, we found out that the way locked DDL per table was working before, it could actually bring inconsistencies to a secondary index on the restore. Like, your backup will run fine, your restore will run fine. If you query the table by primary key, everything will be fine. However, if you query the table using a secondary index, there was no data there. So, and like, that's why it's hard to say 100%. Like, you can even like run a checksum on a case like this, and if the checksum is running on the primary key, it will not be able to spot this particular issue.
Yeah. And I mean, here's the thing. A lot of applications also make specific use of either, unique data types or even pointers back to file systems. So I've worked with people who have stored metadata directly in their database, and it points back to like a image or a JSON file on disk. And a lot of times the metadata will be restored, but not the disk, because they're two separate backups, right? And so you'll notice that a lot. Similar as you get into sharded systems, the complexity of sharded systems become even greater because you have to do point in time across multiple sharded, databases, which is a challenge. And a lot of engineering effort goes into databases that are sharded by default. And a lot of times they can't even guarantee the consistency across the board. And Harry, to answer your question specifically on number of files or tables, that's not always going to be indicative, right? So looking at the number of tables, all the tables can restore, but the question is there one or two column or rows that are missing? And, we mentioned, I mentioned earlier, like, we'll use InnoDB TRX commit setting, right? So there's a setting in InnoDB that if you set it to, one setting versus another, it will force commit. So you'll have more consistency, but if you change it, you can make it so it delays committing data to disk so you can get better performance. Having that set, you could lose a second worth of data and you wouldn't even note it. Like it would come back up, the database would be restored, but you couldn't roll to that second. So sometimes you can lose a second or two. Sometimes you can't.
There's something quite simple that will not provide you 100% insurance, but you have to just look at the logs. So very often, warnings and errors, I couldn't write this file. Sometimes the backup ends up done, but there's some information that tells you that we had problems doing this or doing that or reading that information. So it's important to check the logs, do a quick check, searching for the most common error, warning, attention, and things like that is also very important. And at the end of the day, there's really an old paper called Reflection on Trusting the Trust. And there are so many things that can fail or can be broken, because sometimes you are making a backup from a corrupt database that is running fine, but the backup will not be in the same shape, or you won't be able to see the same data just because the source of the backup was corrupt. So there are tons of things that can go wrong, but this doesn't mean that usually backups go wrong. Usually backups go fine, and if it says done.
But this is why a lot of people employ a strategy for backups that is multi-tiered, right? They'll look at file system snapshots as well as, logical backups. Sometimes they'll do, table, specific backups. I mean, like there's different kind of backup methodologies in what you're doing. And I think that sometimes defense in layers is the answer for a lot of people.
And I believe, like, in summary, we can think that we need to be prepared for the most known issues, but you will never be prepared for everything.
And I mean, generally these are so rare in a lot of cases that you would have, you take a backup on a corrupt system and you don't catch that corruption during the backup. It can happen, but let's not scare people, because you're talking about, something that is so infrequent. You might see that once in your lifetime, probably never in your lifetime.
And one thing that we always favor in extra backup development, everything that we know that it can fail silently, like we know that people usually take a backup and don't prepare the backup. They only prepare when they need to restore. So we always try the things that we know that can possibly either fail on prepare or when you restore. We favor on halting the backup while you are taking it. So that is something that people will notice, like, okay, my backup did not complete, rather than it completed the backup, but it failed on the prepare phase. So that's one thing we always favor, like try to exit as early as possible in the backup stage.
Yeah, and I think that this is where, we're trying to do a lot to protect things because backups are so critical. And it's important to note that a lot of engineering effort goes into testing, backup and restore processes and the tools that are out there in the space. But I think that it's mindful to for everyone to realize that hey, there are going to be some odd things. Make sure you have multiple backups. Don't just keep one, right? Like don't just have I'm going to have last night's backup. That's it. Typically like some sort of rotation for a week is a recommendation. Maybe store once a month offsite or something. If you're going to send up to S3 buckets, that's cool, but realize that does take a fair amount of time for bigger data sets to pull back from S3 as well. So often having one online will be a best practice, but you also should encrypt those backups. One of the biggest issues you see with data leaks right now is unencrypted backups in S3 buckets. People take the backup, they dump them out there. Somebody comes, grabs the backup, tests your recovery for you, which is awesome because congratulations, your recovery worked. And now the dark web has your data and they proved that your backup works. That is not a recommended, just in case anybody's wondering, that's not a recommended best practice for testing your backups. Okay. Just saying. So you're going to want to do things like that. If you're running in the cloud, I do like file system snapshots. If you're using LVMs, I do like file system snapshots still. I think, those have their place occasionally, especially, for certain workloads. There's a variety of things you can do. You're going to want to make sure that you set things up. Now, Harry, to answer your question, Harry's asking a lot of questions today. Thank you, Harry, for asking so many excellent questions. Are there pre-steps? So there's a couple things when you talk about, pre-steps, there's the stuff built into Xtrabackup that does some checks, right? Marcelo, there's some things that does to prepare the backup, before it runs. But one thing that you have to be mindful of is there's a reason that people back up hot. And that's because the performance on a lot of systems is so critical. And, doing some of these steps, depending on what they are, they can lead to higher amounts of consistency, but it can lock the database or prevent certain activities from happening in a timely manner. So, right, because when we used to do MySQL dumps all the time, and that was our main method of backup, grabbing a database level lock or a full lock there was something we would often do. And then, on those big data sets, 3 days later, when people could start actually doing stuff again on the database, we'd be like, woohoo, we're done. But it would lock for a really long time. So, what can you do? But thank you for the excellent questions and the comments. If you didn't see, there was a couple, other, the blockchain for consistency guarantees, which is an interesting. I've seen that actually, that there's a couple projects in different databases to try and employ that, not necessarily for backup or guarantees, but for auditing, which is another interesting use case, right? Because you end up having transactions that you're like, who did that transaction? Why did it go through? And how can we prove who did what? And so I think that blockchain has some interesting implications if used correctly. But again, there's overhead to each one of those kind of protections that you implement. So that is something to keep in mind. So we're all caught up on questions, but thank you everybody for the excellent questions. So we've got about 5 minutes, but we can go over if more questions come in. Marcelo or Pep, was there anything that we tend to start these off with a few topics, but then we go where the audience takes us, right? We go wherever they ask questions, and we don't know where that's going to be. Was there anything that you really wanted to make sure that we, told people about today? As they look up and they go, no, not really.
Well, we already said that, but you need to test recovery at least once, just to have a set of scripts to be able to perform a recovery. Because you don't want to learn how to make a recovery while your database is stopped.
No,
Okay.
I disagree, Pep.
Lifetime advice.
I disagree because I like excitement. And who doesn't like the excitement and the pizzazz of learning all about?
I had a workmate that had a sticker on his laptop that said, "Real men make no backups." So if you like risk, don't do backups. And it's like,
Oh yeah, that's living on the edge, right? So,
hmm,
you know, who doesn't want that kind of adrenaline? I'm sure that's something that we all strive for. Marcelo, anything you wanted to close up on?
I would say, like, from an engineering point of view, like, if anyone out there has like features that they would like to be implemented on Extra Backup, or they have questions, we have a forums at percona.com where myself and other engineers and people from services are always engaged too. So bring your questions out there. If you have some feature or anything that you would like to see implemented on the tool, we have jira.percona.com where you can raise a feature request, and those are always very welcome. And people that feel like to, we are open source, so just do try to implement whatever you want yourself or fix a bug and open a pull request. We will be more than happy to review and engage from you from GitHub.
So we got a question from Mayo. I think I'm pronouncing that right, but Mayo wants to know if there's any one-on-one style. Now, I seem to remember a Dr. Extra Backup. Who you know, like that persona sticks in my head.
yeah.
Who could that be? Who could? Oh, wait, that is our one and esteemed guest here. So Mayo. There are a couple of YouTube videos out there on our channel. Mr. Pep here actually talked about this extensively. You know, if you prefer video, there's also some blogs on our blog that you can grab that as well. But let me see if I can post a link here into the chat for you if you wanted to take a look at his specific series on that. He did a Percona Live. Oh, that's the second one. I should have posted the first one, but you should be able to get the link. It's a 2-part video if you really want to know the ins and outs of Extra Backup and how to use it for your backup strategy. We also have a couple of podcasts where I sat down with Pep and a few others where we talk specifically about backup policies. So those are a couple other good resources to get to. So I would recommend those. But appreciate the question. Thank you very much for doing it. Now, for those of you who are still on, and we've got 15 people right now watching, if you haven't liked this, like it, please. It helps us out. And subscribe, so that way you can get notifications when we go live again. You know, we would love for you to come back and hear us talk next time. So again, I said the schedule is going to be a little wonky between now and the end of the year, just because of holidays and whatnot. Next time we're going to skip next week, and then we'll come back, you know, and we should be talking about Postgres, and then we'll be moving on to PMM before hitting Mongo and MySQL again. So we try and rotate technologies and invite different people. And if there are people who would love to come on and talk live with me, this is not a Percona show. I mean, it is a Percona show just because it has our logo up there, and I work for Percona, but I love to have people who are not from Percona. So if you would like to come on, so, you know, Bianchi, Wagner, come on, you can come on, and talk. I don't mind. Come on, you know, or anybody else out there in the community. Feel free to jump on, you know, have a chat with me. Would love to, you know, hear from you and see what kind of cool things you're doing. And, you know, here's the thing. We can do this multiple ways when you come on. You can talk like we talked today. If you want to show some slides, show some slides. You want to get down to the console, get down into the console. Like, you know, do it. You know, we're here to showcase, answer questions, show people some awesome things. You know, we're here for the community. So we do appreciate all of you hanging out with us. We know you have some choices for where you spend your time. So I'm glad it's here. But thanks, everybody. We appreciate it, and we will see you next time.